I think at this point, it's safe to say Blade Runner is a film that needs no introduction, right? The summer flop, which became a cult classic, reevaluated as a masterpiece with subsequent cuts, now widely considered one of the greatest movies of all time. The film's influence in cyberpunk and sci-fi world building more broadly is staggering, and itself remains a poignant example of special effects mastery applied to expressing personal and sociological themes. For a generation of filmgoers, Blade Runner was an essential text for developing their cinephilia. But even a film this beloved has a rather substantial blight on its legacy. I'm not talking about criticisms that Blade Runner is boring, which are entirely subjective and not a perspective I can relate to at all, nor that the many different versions are a problem, given Ridley Scott has been very clear on the final cut being his preferred version, while still making the other cuts easily available for fans to pick and choose their own favorite. No, I'm talking about the film's infamous love scene. I put love scene in quotation marks because any consent is highly dubious. Rachel clearly retreats from Deckard's kiss, and when she tries to leave his apartment, Deckard corners Rachel, throws her against a wall, and instructs her with how to ask him to kiss her. Rachel reluctantly does, but only in response to Deckard's violence and coercion. In practice, the scene depicts an assault, with Deckard physically imposing his will on Rachel and only gaining a slim verbal permission through intimidation. This has proven a point of contention. Some critics have charged the scene with perpetuating a violent culture against women, and even the filmmakers have expressed their disappointments. Actress Sean Young thought the scene was too violent. Producer Michael Dealey referred to it as a so-called love scene. Even Ridley Scott, never shy about trumpeting the virtues of his own work, called the scene one of the least successful in the film. But the most cutting summation of the scene and its failure comes from production executive Katie Haber, who claimed, "That was not a love scene. That was a hate scene." And I want to unpack this, as I think there's some serious misconceptions about this scene and its place within the film. To be clear, I do agree with Haber's assessment. I do think this is a hate scene, an explicit act of violence and abuse underpinned by Deckard's objectification of Rachel. What I disagree with is the idea that the scene is a Bondian-esque accidental assault, where the film is ignorantly conflating coercion with seduction and presenting a sex pest as a romantic hero. Blade Runner's hate scene is not an aberration from what is otherwise an uncritical romance. It is a further expression of the violence integral to Deckard's character, his relationship with Rachel, and the broader narrative and themes of the film. The dynamics of the relationship are not just inherently unequal, but inherently hostile. Rachel is a replicant, the film's word for android, and Deckard is a Blade Runner, a cop who hunts down runaway replicants. He is a state-appointed oppressor of her people, a killer of slaves who refuse to serve, and that dynamic is apparent in Deckard's apartment. Beyond the explicit violence, there is also the implied threat that if Rachel refuses Deckard, she too will be killed for refusing to serve. As he himself explained when they first met,
"Replicants are like any other machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard. If they're a benefit, it's not my problem."
And to be sure, Blade Runner does portray Deckard's growing disillusionment with this profession and the ideologies it is based in, along with a burgeoning empathy for replicants awakened in no small part by Rachel. But it's a long road to empathy. Deckard's scenes with Rachel are consistently rooted in his prejudices. Their first scene is a business meeting which transforms into an interrogation of Rachel's humanity, concluding with Deckard learning Rachel is a replicant and using language to dehumanize her.
Suspect, how can it not know what it is?
In their second scene, Rachel clings to her memories as proof that she's human, while Deckard cruelly exposes that those are actually implants from Tyrell's niece and dismisses her. The first modest gesture of kindness Deckard shows Rachel is inviting her out to join him for a drink, but this is motivated purely by his attraction to her. That might sound affectionate, but there is a long history of bigots lusting after the members of the marginalized group they hate, be it the fetishization of black or trans bodies, or the straight men who loathe the women they desire. Attraction and contempt can go hand in hand, and this is the root of Blade Runner's hate scene, that Deckard can want Rachel, yet still deny her autonomy and personhood. It's the core of his own diagnosis, of replicants as a benefit or a hazard, and this is one that can benefit me by giving me what I want. The replicants who are a hazard, who can't benefit Deckard, are fair game, evident in his continuing to hunt replicants following the apartment scene, killing Pris and attempting to kill Roy. If this were a love scene, Deckard couldn't turn around and continue murdering the members of Rachel's community on the basis of existing. In what Deckard thinks will be his final moments before he dies, he uses the last ounce of his strength to spit at Roy, still viewing this replicant as subhuman. It's certainly possible that Deckard is changed by Roy's kindness in saving his life, and that the subsequent Tears in Rain speech reshapes his worldview on replicants. But the specter of violence still lingers. As Deckard returns to his apartment looking for Rachel, unsure if she has been killed by Gaff, he finds a body covered by a blanket. Deckard reaches down to remove the sheet, the camera tilting to follow Deckard's hand, pistol firmly in grip. The tension is partially that Rachel may already be dead,
It's too bad she won't live!
but also that, if she is alive, Deckard may be about to kill her. He does not, however. Instead, Deckard kisses Rachel's cheek, asks if she loves him, and the two run off together. This would seemingly align the film with a straightforward love story rather than the more complex portrait of abuse I'm trying to paint. But so much of the scene is cast in darkness, both literally in the lighting and the blackness which envelops the frame as the elevator doors close in on the characters, and figuratively in the uncertain future which awaits Deckard and Rachel, that I have difficulty accepting this ending as anything remotely romantic. The inherent ambiguity in the film's sudden ending is enhanced precisely because of how toxic the relationship is. The uncertainties are not just how long Rachel has to live, or if the pair will be hunted by Gaff or another Blade Runner, but that Rachel is now trapped with this violent killer, whose burgeoning empathy for replicants has still consistently been marked by abuse and disgust. But what other choice does she have? Where else could she go? Could she even go without inciting Deckard's wrath? Again, these disturbing questions are not an aberration from what is otherwise a conventional romantic subplot in a sci-fi action movie. They are entirely consistent with how the film portrays Deckard and Rachel's relationship, one couched in cruelty, bigotry, and violence. This portrait has admittedly been muddled. The studio-mandated happy ending that was slapped onto Blade Runner's original theatrical release is widely derided for its sudden break from a dark techno-dystopia and embrace of green forests, and for its last-minute retcons to allow for an uncomplicated happy ending. But the reframing of Deckard and Rachel's relationship is just as egregious. Rather than the darkness and toxicity evident throughout the rest of the film, this ending suddenly yields to conventional romance, of lovers leaving the darkness and heading towards the sunrise, a literal new day, something the rest of the film emphatically does not support. This ending would thankfully be excised from future cuts, which restored ambiguity, but legacy sequel Blade Runner 2049 would again reframe the relationship as a romance, with Harrison Ford's performance and the filmmaking suggesting this deep love affair and romantic longing for the now departed Rachel. Their love is also the basis for a miracle child, born from a replicant who may well spark a full-on revolution within this world. There is at least some doubt cast over this framing, given we only get Deckard's perspective on the relationship rather than Rachel's, which at least preserves the possibility that we're only getting a distorted and inaccurate account of the past. And that is noteworthy given this series' interest in how memories, and false memories, define one's sense of personhood. Granted, These aren't ambiguities Denis Villeneuve is particularly interested in parsing, 2049 ultimately taking the relationship at face value. But Blade Runner does not. For however the romance has been skewed by alternate cuts and legacy sequels, the final cut of Blade Runner portrays a brutal and abusive relationship, extending the use of Deckard as protagonist not because he is the hero of the story, but because he is a vessel for exploring a horrific dystopia. His role as a Blade Runner, combined with his treatment of Rachel, reveals the social stratification of this society at both a systemic and interpersonal level, and the intermingling between those two levels. Which raises a simple question. Was that the intent? Did the filmmakers deliberately design an abusive relationship as a means of extending commentary on a bigoted society built on the exploitation of an underclass? Because their comments of disappointment in the love scene suggest otherwise, that they failed to portray a romance rather than succeeded at portraying abuse. The scene itself is contradictory, capturing Deckard's violence and Rachel's powerlessness with horrifying precision. But the tension in the score soon gives way to swooning Vangelis music, implying a love scene. I think the scene is disturbing, but is it meant to be? To answer this question, we need to peel back to the genesis of the love scene itself, which was a point of contention for original screenwriter Hampton Fancher, who did not want the film to have a love scene at all, and only added one at the insistence of Ridley and Michael Dealey. The relationship with Rachel was integral to early drafts of the script, but it was always an exceedingly dark relationship, with some early drafts ending with either Rachel killing herself or being killed by Deckard. Eventually, though, a love scene was added, and across different drafts are the blueprint for the scene which appears in the film, with Deckard instructing Rachel with how to ask for him to kiss her and how to perform sexually. The main difference is the scene as written isn't violent. Deckard does not force himself on Rachel, and consent is more apparent. Rachel wants Deckard, and wants the language to ask for him. It was written to be erotic, and was intended to be shot as such. But on set, it wasn't working. The steamy and lustful love scene just wasn't playing, and so Ridley shifted to the violence we now see on screen. Ridley doesn't offer much introspection as to why the love scene wasn't working. One prominent theory is simply that Harrison Ford and Sean Young just didn't get along on the set, lacking the chemistry to believably portray a shared lust and desire. Hostility was much more believable from this pair. That could absolutely be a factor, but at a more basic level, I believe the love scene wasn't working as a love scene because it lacked the foundations for a genuine romance. It is not simply that the actors didn't click, but that the relationship built in prior scenes did not support eroticism, and attempting to portray it here felt unnatural and dishonest. The pivot to violent bullying was not arbitrary. It more accurately reflected what the rest of Blade Runner was doing. And this is also implicit in the scene as scripted. Fancher may have written the love scene intending it to be erotic and consensual, but the subtext of a powerful man directing a young, inexperienced, and vulnerable woman in how to yield to him sexually is inherently rooted in coercion. The violence is there between the lines, and Ridley could not translate those lines to the screen until he accepted that violence. Ultimately, was it intentional? Proves an inadequate question, as intent changed across many people over the course of production. But it certainly wasn't accidental. More footage for the love scene was shot, which eventually did become more erotic and sympathetic, but that material was scrapped, ensuring the scene read as brutal and coercive. The evolution of the love scene, from conception to scripting to shooting to editing, reveals a transformation and eventual embrace of the inherent violence embedded within the moment and the relationship more broadly. A man instructing a vulnerable woman with how to perform sexually is inherently exploitative, whether written that way or not. A sex act, which begins in bullying and barbarism, is an assault, even if it eventually grows more tender. A cop who kills the members of a marginalized class, even if he's starting to feel bad about it, cannot simply love a member of that class. Blade Runner's love scene was inevitably always going to be a hate scene, because Blade Runner is not a love story.